This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint, you deserve the best security.
This week was already a kind of news pile-up, one massive news story after another. And then late Thursday, after we'd actually already recorded our show, yet more news, big news breaking out of Israel. We're going to talk about all of that and a conversation with one of Israel's most trusted voices, trusted journalists. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts. Wow. Jonathan, I mean, we've had some dramatic days in this country ever since the judicial overhaul was announced. But this day, I think the word showdown probably is apt. We should say we recorded our whole program Thursday afternoon, but the developments dragged us back to our podcast studio to record all of the latest developments. We're speaking now. It's Thursday, almost 9:30 p.m.
Yeah, in the words of Michael Corleone, just when I think I've got out, they pull me back in. So we're right back because it was high drama. I mean, word was coming out of Israel that the defense minister was going to make a big announcement tonight. We thought he was going to say, I'm pulling my support. Then that speech was pulled. And instead, we got a speech from the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, which has just happened as you and I record. So let's start with the hardest news of all, the most immediate news. What did Netanyahu say? Lots of speculation that he was going to say the whole thing is on hold and paused. He didn't say that, Yoni. What did he say?
Well, let's, the funny thing is that all of this was a lot of backroom drama. And the last sort of bottom line of it is that Netanyahu does indeed speak to the Israeli public a few minutes ago and says essentially that he will continue with the legislation next week, which was, I remind you, just part of the originally planned legislation. It has to do with the Judicial Appointments Committee. He said several other things, a very vague promise for a Bill of Rights and a vague promise to change a little bit of the makeup of the override clause. But, when Netanyahu, let's say veterans of Israeli politics, when they hear Netanyahu say, I promise to do that, they can take it with a grain of salt. But the essential thing that he said, or the bottom line, is the legislation continues next week. But let's talk about a little bit of the drama that happened behind closed doors. And you mentioned this around a Thursday afternoon. It became clear that the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, was going to speak. He called for a press conference to speak to the Israeli public and to tell the Israeli public, essentially, I'm paraphrasing what he planned to say, the military will break apart if we continue with this legislation. We must press the brakes. We must hit the brakes and halt the legislation. I remind you that the background to all this is many, many reservists and elite forces in Israel, including the Air Force, saying they will not show up for reserve duty if this legislation continues. Then what we heard next was that Gallant was called into a meeting with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu himself said that he will call a press op, and then all hell broke loose in the Likud. There were many, many ministers attacking Gallant himself, calling him a traitor, or even worse in Likud jargon, Bennett. And Yariv Levin was reported, the justice minister reported to threaten that he would quit. Yair Netanyahu, who is extremely influential in the Likud, wrote that anyone saying that this legislation will be postponed is a liar. So it became very clear that what we're feeling and what we're hearing is a showdown between two forces in the Likud, the people who really want this reform and are pushing it forward, and some voices, and they are not a small group. There's about 6 or 7 people, Gallant among them, saying we cannot move forward the way it is. Right now, it looks like the group that won is the Yariv Levin group, but we don't know what will happen until this legislation has to come forth next week.
So the battleground, in a way, was the mind of the Prime Minister. These were two camps tugging and pulling at the Prime Minister. And in the early part of the day, it seemed as if the Prime Minister himself was going to, in effect, bow to Gallant and the sort of military crowd and say, okay, the whole thing is postponed. And in a way, that was perhaps, we can guess, an outcome he might have quite liked. I mean, we talked on this podcast in recent weeks about what is the ladder he can climb down. And in some ways, his defense minister was handing him the ladder, because that would have allowed the Prime Minister to say, look, I would have loved to have done this, but I can't, because the generals and the reservists and my own defense minister is holding me back. And that gave him the ladder. Presumably then his son, who is really a figure to watch. I mean, you know, the word is overused, but there is something quasi-fascistic about the messages that come out of that guy's mouth. I mean, he is a Don Jr. figure, Yair Netanyahu. He seems to have been pulling his father back the other way. And as you say, it seems to be that he won. And so now we have this vote next week. And I do just wonder if that's going to be the next ladder, because could there be a defeat next week that then Netanyahu says, well, I did try everything. I tried as hard as I could and I just couldn't move forward with it. And the answer to that depends on this question, which is Gallant and whose army, as it were? How many people does he have behind him who might vote with him to vote this down next week, if indeed he does vote it down? Maybe he hasn't got the stomach for that.
Look, the Likud has 32 members. You need a 61 vote on this or it doesn't pass. And I wrote down the names of 7 members of the Likud who could well not show up for the vote or vote against, right? It's Gallant, it's Dichter, Edelstein, David Bitan, who we mentioned last week, Dani Danon, Nir Barkat, Eli Dalal. These are people who in some way or another voiced their concerns and said that the Likud should halt the legislation. So that can happen. Right? And again, what we're seeing, the fact that the ruling party in Israel is not coming to this united is incredibly important. You, by the way, mentioned that Netanyahu hoped that Gallant could be the latter. There are people who are actually saying maybe Netanyahu created the latter for Gallant and planned this whole thing for him to say these words, although we also know that he thinks this. And then at the very last minute caved under pressure. We also need to zoom out from the whole thing, Jonathan, and mention the coalition already blinked. Remember Yariv Levin 3 months ago when he detailed his plan, he wanted to bring a huge and a very meticulous and detailed plan to the Knesset. What's left of it is the makeup of, again, the Judicial Appointments Committee. A slight change in wording there, right? Instead of complete control over the judges the coalition wanted to have, they will have less of a control, but it's still enough. So that is what will happen next week. Protests, we must say, are not dying down. Quite the opposite. This was a very, very dramatic day in that arena as well. Almost 100 Israelis were arrested. Protests all around the country, and there is no chance this will die down, especially after what Netanyahu said tonight and after what we know Gallant was wanted to say and didn't say.
Yeah, I think it's all about this weekend now, because the protesters, yes, have a big motivation to up the ante, to increase their numbers, increase the volume of their protests, because it's crunch time next week, and therefore they will want to be there with full force, and they will have seen that this coalition is vulnerable. There are cracks, and they will want to be pushing a wedge into those cracks to open them wider. But I would also be guessing there will be a lot of phone calls behind the scenes, and particularly, I would guess, between the military and the political echelon, where there will be more military voices saying, if you go ahead, X, Y, and Z will happen. And they will be talking about stuff that maybe you and I don't know, about other units, other reservists, other senior, maybe there are very senior officers who will say, we walk if this goes ahead. I mean, I don't know. But you could imagine a mutiny of the generals or something. Is that possible? I would say everything is now possible. And those communications will, I think, be going on in this interval, this hiatus between now and the first votes, which are what, Monday or Tuesday?
Expected Monday or Tuesday next week, indeed. And I think you're right that we are really, the crunch time is the right way to describe it. Tensions are high on both sides. We don't yet know how this will end and if the legislation will actually pass next week. But definitely, we are in the most dramatic days and dramatic hours of this judicial overhaul. If I may, I would want to say something not only about National Disruption Day, but also about International Disruption Day and what has been happening in the last couple of days in Israel. I think the Netanyahu government's trying to prove that book right. What was it? How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. So maybe we should just go through the list of what we have seen in 3 days, right? Just these 3 days. The Knesset passing a law repealing the disengagement from northern Samaria, the Biden administration then doing something quite unusual, summoning the Israeli ambassador for a dressing down or a clarification. Last time that happened was 2009. Netanyahu also receiving something of a civics lesson from the American president in a phone call, but not an invite to the White House yet. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister of Israel, standing with a map of Greater Israel, Israel, includes, of course, Jordan, and saying that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, and that obviously upsetting many people, but Jordan among them, and Israel having to clarify and say that it respects the territorial sovereignty of Jordan. Shall I continue? Miri Regev, minister in the government, minister of transport, saying that she visited Dubai and she didn't like Dubai, only followed by the minister of foreign affairs here in Israel having to basically walk that back and say Dubai is a great country, and Bibi also pulling the law that targets Christian minorities. This is all in 3 days, Jonathan. We are at the opening of the month of Ramadan. We will probably be needing our friends if there is any sort of flare-ups, friends like the Jordanians, the Emirates, and the Americans, not doing very good on all of those tracks this week.
What all this reminds me of a bit is that debate that happened in Washington in that 3-month period between Donald Trump being elected and then him being sworn into office in January 2017. There was this hope, but sort of consensus among the political establishment that he would be tamed by office, that Donald Trump would become presidential and he would moderate. And again, from some distance, this is my Johnny was right thing. I was writing here saying, no, this is, what you see is what you get with him. But I didn't know for certain. I just thought that's how he would be. But I didn't know how Smotrich and Ben Gvir and the other characters would be. But so far, the early evidence is these people are absolutely not tamed or moderated by office. Smotrich is fascinating because he does have an external-facing role, more than Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's national security minister. As finance minister, you have to meet a lot of people. You have to have global interactions and cooperation, etc. He's somebody who's a bit more on the world international stage. And for him to do this unbelievably doubly inflammatory thing, I mean, he's there in front of, the sort of Jabotinskyite, Shtegadot, two banks of the river map, the Beitar logo, Beitar youth movement of old, rather than particularly the football team, that map that shows what is that? That's the mandatory Palestine map from 1917, really, which has Transjordan and Israel in one map. Just the image of that is so unbelievably provocative, suggesting expansionism. But to then say there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, I mean, of course we know there are people on the far right of Israeli politics, Jewish politics, who think that, but it was the sort of thing that was said in the 70s and then became, I'm not going to say exactly flat earth, but sort of like that, as if denying reality. There is obviously a Palestinian people. You don't have to be some peacenik to just recognize objective reality. Mm-hmm. And for him to deny that as somebody who is a finance minister who has to shake their hand and meet his counterparts in, Berlin or Washington or London, it's mind-boggling, but also it should disabuse anybody of any delusions they had that somehow wearing the suit and driving in the ministerial car would somehow moderate and temper these people. I can say this harder for you. These people are fanatics and they shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near power. But now they are near power. They are not moderated by it. They are not tamed by it. And they are going to keep on lighting fires and, burning the house down wherever they go. So even when you put aside the judicial reform stuff, this is a massive, flashing red signal for the Israeli public and anyone who cares about Israel.
When Netanyahu made Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was indicted 8 times, to be the minister of the police, and when he made Bezalel Smotrich, from the extreme far right of Israeli politics, the fringes of the fringes, the finance minister, and a minister in the Ministry of Defense, I shall remind you, he said, power brings responsibility. Well, indeed, power brings responsibility to those who can handle it. And as you said, it is quite clear that if we were waiting for an answer about will these people, like other politicians in Israeli history, Ariel Sharon becoming the centrist and responsible adult and realizing that Israel needs to be ruled really from the center and to make these decisions as a responsible adult. Naftali Bennett is another example that comes to mind. Obviously, I think the answer to the question about Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir is a resounding no. But the bigger question is, where is Benjamin Netanyahu in all of this? I think there are many Israelis. I just described to you 3 days of Israeli news, right? And I think a lot of Israelis are feeling like they're those kids sitting in a school bus and the driver is left. Like there were times in which Netanyahu would, even just for the declaration, right, say, listen, gag order, everyone in the Likud, no one says anything. Or no one speaks, right? Or no one speaks about the United States, no one speaks about the UAE, just don't talk about it. That isn't even something that is implemented. So I have a hard time saying what the bigger picture is here and where this is heading. But as I said, if you feel like you're a kid on a school bus and the driver's not there, then this is not heading to a very great place.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad you mentioned that, because it's a trap that I am prone to falling into, which is to glom onto Ben Gvir and Smotrich and thereby exempt Netanyahu himself. This bill, for example, repealing an aspect of the disengagement law of 2005, famously everyone around the world knows about disengagement from Gaza, but of course there was also this withdrawal from 4 settlements, towns, villages on the West Bank, which was sort of ruled off limits to settlement activity. They had to be emptied out. And essentially that has been unpicked. And Netanyahu is the head of this government that has done it, to say, yeah, settlers, knock yourselves out. You can go back there, in effect, to those places.
He did hurry and say that they won't be
be
building new settlements
really,
there, but I'm not sure that is
discomfort and unsettle governments around the world. It doesn't surprise me at all that the United States is angry, because the disengagement of 2005 was just the kind of move that, the international community, however you want to define that, regarded as a hugely important step in terms of, the now mythic 2-state solution that is the official goal of the international diplomatic community. If that is being wound back, that is going to really trouble the United States and others. Of course, they're going to condemn it. So Israel's open, Netanyahu himself, who normally, as you've said, is quite skillful at managing the ebb and flow of international relations. Yes, you throw some red meat to your people back home, but then you calm everyone down internationally. He is setting himself up for a war on multiple fronts. Diplomatic war is all I'm talking about, political war, but who knows what else. Jordan, the United States, the international Jewish opinion with the judicial overhaul or judicial coup, as many are calling it. It really does make you wonder what's happened to him in terms of just his, I'm not making comment on, the rights and wrongs, but just his political touch. Right. Don't know where it is. So none of this is good. We are going to talk about all of this with one of Israel's most sage commentators who, just like you, Yonit, occupies a very special place in Israel's broadcasting firmament.
Ilana Dayan is, I think it's safe to say, the most well-respected journalist in Israel. She has spearheaded the investigative news program Uvda for the past 30 years, the Israeli version of 60 Minutes, and much to my chagrin, she still gets the best interviewees in the land and beyond. But I am proud and happy to call her my dear friend. Ilana has a doctorate in law from Yale University, teaches constitutional law in the University of Tel Aviv, and was uniquely positioned to discuss the events in Israel even before her statement last week, but that is what we want to open our conversation with. Ilana, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Yonit, my dear friend, and with you, Jonathan. Nice to get to know you. I listen to you both.
Very good to meet you too.
It's good to meet you too.
It's our pleasure. So, Ilana, after 30 years of a career as an objective journalist, you spoke your mind about the judicial overhaul in the very first lines of your program on primetime television last week, and we asked you to read out what you said on air, this time in English. I will just make clear that Simcha Rotman, who you mentioned, is the head of the Constitution Committee in the Knesset, the man who's spearheading this legislation. And Alice Miller is, of course, the woman who petitioned the Supreme Court in Israel and got the military to open the ranks to the Israeli Air Force and specifically their pilots' course. So let's hear your monologue on air last week. That's what we will be opening with.
I'll do that. I'll just mention that we aired that program one day after the president of Israel laid out his own proposal, and it was rejected by the coalition. And for that matter, I related to what happened one night before. So that's what I said. I would like to do something I've never done before. We have been airing Uvda for nearly 30 years now, bringing you approximately one story a week. For years, I've been under the notion that journalists should keep their opinions to themselves. But as of last night, it has become clear where we are heading. So tonight, I wish to speak from my heart, not necessarily as a journalist, but as Ilana, the daughter of Vilma and Mordechai, God rest their soul, Zichronam Livracha, who migrated from South America because of Zionism and stayed here because for them and for me, it was the greatest place on earth, and for my kids as well. All three of them are sons of this land. All three want to build their homes here, straight homes, gay homes, but mostly good homes, and very Israeli ones. I wish I could tell them that everything is going to be all right, but they have learned years ago to spot my fake optimism from miles, and my optimism ran out. Even before last night's events, it ended roughly when Simcha Rothman told Ben Shani not long ago on our program that the Supreme Court justices ruled that Alice Miller should be allowed to join the IDF Flight Academy only because she looked like a nice person, like their next-door neighbor, not because she deserves to, not because we deserve to have women fighter pilots and naval officers or women that soar in general, only because she looked like a nice person, and to Simcha Rothman, perhaps less so. So, as this process moves forward, don't believe those who say that it will be all right, that the rights of gay, women, Arab, press, scholars, poor people, and eventually Orthodox and other groups will not be harmed. How do I know? Because I believe most of what Simcha Rothman and Yariv Levin say, and I see what they do. Because a regime that insists on appointing councils whose advice will not count, insists on appointing judges according to their politics, and insists on cutting their wings just in case, insists on enacting laws which cannot be overruled and denying human rights and human liberties that we cannot live without, that kind of regime would take us to a place no democracy has ever come back alive from, because no government takes that kind of power just for show, just like no one accumulates tons of gunpowder just to paint a children's drawing on the wall. And don't let the noise fool you. It's not that important if Bibi wants to cancel his trial and Gafni wants to cancel the mandatory draft and Derry wants to cancel his criminal record. It's just unimportant noise. Like Justice Barak's mistakes and the Supreme Court's wrongful rulings. There were some along the way, of course there were. But there's nothing about this reform that is meant to fix them. This is a suction of power, great and absolute power, to one place only. So now, with no compromise in sight, ask yourself one question. Is there one thing, just one thing, that the majority could not inflict on the minority after this move is complete? And then, imagine yourselves as part of that minority, any minority. And after that, choose on which side of history you'd rather be. And what will you tell one day the kids of this winter of 2023?
It's so powerful hearing it for me a second or third time, but now obviously in English. That line, such a regime takes us to a place from which no democracy has ever returned alive. It's an incredibly stark warning. What do you say, Ilana, to those who absolutely agree with the views you've expressed, but worry that editorializing like that is crossing a Rubicon, that from now on you won't be seen as a impartial umpire, but as a player on the field, a kind of partisan, and who say, given particularly the kind of changes that are underway here, it would actually be more valuable for you to remain as a kind of trusted purveyor, to quote the name of your show, of the facts, rather than a combatant, which is, they might worry, how you will now forever be seen.
You know, Yonit and I had this conversation in text and subtext for many years, and we both, I think, tried very hard to stay in the business of news rather than views. And I still see myself as a reporter whose job is to go out every morning, get the facts, speak the truth, and report it to our viewers. But nonetheless, these events of these last months created, I guess, a unique kind of clarity for me as to the profession and what it mandates these days. And I think it is, Jonathan, partly telling truth from false and speaking truth to power, which we have to do anyway as journalists. And in this case, to give people a sense of what's really going on, notwithstanding the fact that we can have many views on the issue and on the situation, but speaking truth to power means telling people what these moves mean to the future of this country. And yes, I felt that I have to cross a Rubicon this time and to speak my mind and to do something I've never done before, and yet to be very careful as to the use of the platform and the screen. I don't intend of becoming an editorial, journalist. I intend of keep doing what I have done for many years, but this time I felt I had to say something, and so I did.
I'm curious about the motive or the thoughts behind it, because the mind goes sort of as an instinct to Walter Cronkite. If we lose Walter Cronkite, we lose America. Now, of course, we don't live in that kind of world anymore. There's not one Walter Cronkite or one America or one Israel, for that matter. And I think that in this issue, which is tearing the country apart, pretty much people have sort of made up their minds. So is the motive here to speak your mind or to change minds?
I've learned a while ago, many years ago, that the most we can do is have people think. We did a story many years ago about a rundown neighborhood in Kiryat Gat in the southern part of Israel, and the only people who were left, kept living in this very miserable building from the 1850s were the oldest and the poorest. And we did that because there was a law undergoing in the Knesset of the public housing law. And we thought that we might influence. The only thing that happened the day after the broadcast was that some kibbutznikim came as volunteers to fix the door of an old lady who was living there. So sometimes all you can do is move people to fix a door. Sometimes all you can do is get people think. And sometimes, just before we started this conversation, I got a WhatsApp message from a hairstylist that we both know personally, Yonit, and he told me, it was powerful. I listened. I'm not sure that Ilan has his mind set about what's happening, but if I got him and his client, who is right now with him, to think, and perhaps they tell themselves, Ilana never did that. And we believed her when she covered so many events and so many issues. We don't have to think the same way she does, but perhaps we might listen.
Because it's absolutely that's I think what gives it its force. It's all the credibility years and years and years of reporting have built up. And we're going to get into the substance, by the way, of the case you set out there, because I think it's essential. But just before we do, it's the concern I would have is that, given particularly, as it were, what you're up against, that you may have confirmed what has been until now not true, but a kind of perennial claim from the Prime Minister that the media is biased, the media is against us. And now he can say, look, even the most, this hugely respected journalist who is dealing in facts, even she's taken a stand against me. This tells you that everything I've been saying for years was always true. That would be, Yonit knows that I'm a worrier about these things. So this is my angst about this, that this, you and what you represent is a very precious asset. And in a way you can only use it once. And that's my concern.
Although we should mention that Netanyahu started his particular war against you a few years back, right? Which is, I think, about 2016, when he called you a representative of the extreme left. And I think that opened up a Pandora's box in his relationship to mainstream media
so
in general.
Bibi didn't need that to call me an extreme leftist. But yes, Jonathan, I agree, and I can relate to what you say. And I feel it even more so ever since last Thursday's broadcast, that we need to be very careful using and spending this credit that we accumulate, all three of us, over the years. And most of all, I speak my mind, but I have to make sure that all the platforms that I have, both on radio and on television, are open and attentive and curious and always welcoming the other point of view with honesty and with responsibility and with journalistic integrity.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask one more maybe personal question before we kind of dive into the judicial overhaul and what it means for Israel, because I know how meticulously you write your texts and how I can only imagine how long you worked on this particular one. You mentioned your children and growing up and having these homes in Israel or going to create these families for themselves. You said straight homes and gay homes. Are you concerned about what this means in this quote unquote new Israel for them to live in this to live in this situation?
Yes, I am, and we'll speak about it, I'm sure, when we dive into the essence of this judicial overhaul. But I'll tell you that I wrote it coming back from a short visit with my daughter, Yaeli. She's with her husband in Philadelphia now. He's studying there, and I was talking to her about her future, and I was thinking with her about her brother's future. And on the plane, I wrote it, and as the plane was landing in Israel, the text was complete. But it had to do with many conversations that I had with the kids, and I guess with many conversations I had with myself about our own biography, my own biography. As you know, I wasn't born in this country. We made Aliyah. We came to Israel from Argentina when I was 6 with my parents, my brother, and my late sister. And on the plane with us were my uncle and my aunt and my cousin Ilana Dayan, who later became consul general in New York, and now he's the chairman of Yad Vashem. And we left Argentina a few years before yet another military junta took over. And before this dirty war exploded and erupted, and tens of thousands of Argentinians disappeared. Many of them were tortured to death. Some of them were classmates of my late sister. So, you know, Argentina for me is a complex event or notion. It is an amazing place with wonderful food and unbelievable football, soccer, as the Americans say, and the one and only Lionel Messi. But Argentina is also a warning sign, because this is a country that has anything other than political stability, everything other than this democratic gene that we do have. And you know, I have a beloved cousin there, and she speaks Hebrew, she understands Hebrew, she follows the news here, she watches Uvda. And you know what she wrote me the other day? She said, okay, I can understand it when it happens here, but you guys, that shouldn't be happening in Israel. And every time she writes to me, she ends with the same word in Spanish, cuídate, take care of yourself, be careful, which is terrifying. I mean, it's the way they think. We never thought like this, Yonit. You know that. Yeah. We never thought we have to take care of ourselves or be careful. We never feared anything like that, and we are not there yet. We are not there yet. Yeah. The thing is that when you are, it's too late. And it's true that democracies die hard and die slowly, and the point of no return is invisible. And it's often very tricky. And that's why I think that we have to turn on the light, bright and powerful, and now.
Mm-hmm. Just on that point about you mentioning your background in Argentina, as the non-Israeli in this conversation, I'm curious how that lands when you mention in Israel. Does it have more force for you to say to your audience that, look, I was not born here, I'm somebody who came from outside, or does it land with an extra power for that reason?
I'm not sure. The one thing that might land with an extra power is the fact that since I was not born here, being an Israeli was never taken for granted by me or my brother or my cousins. And so the Zionist miracle is a very personal and intimate and emotional miracle for me. And that lands powerful, I hope, with people who listen, because it means, you know, I got a WhatsApp from an extreme right-wing guy Saturday night, and I don't know him. And he wrote me, until now I believe that you love this country. Now I know that you're willing to burn everything down after I heard your monologue. And I answered him, I responded. I said, I thought that everything I said came out of deep love to this country, out of sheer and simple patriotism. You are free to think otherwise, and that's okay. You can disagree with me, with the judicial reform, with everything I think. But just bear in mind that I love this country. And he wrote back, I believe you, and I appreciate your response. So maybe we did something.
Move the door.
Yeah.
It's almost 12 weeks into this inner turmoil, and the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, meticulously setting down his plan. Let's sort of pause and look at where we are. I think it's safe to say that the coalition did not expect this sort of pushback in so many aspects of Israeli life. The protesters that are stepping up and filling the streets, the reservists that are saying that they're not coming to duty, the economists that are warning. Like, it's pretty safe to say they did not expect this kind of pushback. And I think it's safe to say that they are at least slightly changing course. How do you see that? How do you see this recent week that we've experienced?
Everything you said, of course, I agree with 100%. And we are now at the point in which, as we speak, the Judicial Committee in the Knesset is supposed to confirm the revised proposal for the revamping of the makeup of the Judicial Appointments Committee. And as you said, there's this book by the Portuguese author on blindness.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes. It's called Blindness in English. Yes.
Yeah, this is the story of on blindness. They had a blind spot, lots of blind spots, as to the public response, as to the fact that people will be invested in protesting this reform, as to the fact that the electorate of Likud and the right wing is less invested by and large, and as to the fact that, the economists, the reserve, everything you mentioned, and the Americans and the international community, there was a blind spot. So now you have the revised proposal. And I think what we have to be attentive to and to see what happens is, A, does it come down the streets? We know it will not. Because I believe that Israelis arrived to this point in time, not naive, and very ripe, all those who lead the protest. And the second thing that we have to see it, what will happen when the revised proposal lands in the Supreme Court? Will the Supreme Court strike down this legislation? And even more important, what will happen if it does? What will the government do? Yariv Levin already stated that will be a crossing of a red line. He will not accept. He thinks such a ruling should not be accepted. But imagine that the Supreme Court only grants an interim order, holding on or stopping the legislation. Even less so. Imagine that the Supreme Court grants a milder decree, what we call an order nisi, which is inviting the government or the coalition to give some reasons, to explain why is it that they go ahead with this, polluting or politicization of the appointments process. And I'll give you another option. What happens if the Supreme Court at the end of the day does not strike down the legislation, but determines that it will be applicable after Bibi is done being prime minister, because he's invested in his trial, because he has a very clear interest in the profile of the Supreme Court, because some of the Supreme Court justices will be sitting on his appeal if and when it is arriving to the Supreme Court. What if they decide? Many options are there for them to decide. So we're up for an interesting era. But Yonit, it's very clear. It's very clear that nobody on the opposition, on the protest, on the streets, nobody is taking this withdrawal, retreat, softening of the judicial overall very seriously. Nobody.
That would be a brilliant play by the Supreme Court if they said, fine, you can have it, but it won't benefit you personally. That would flush out completely his motive for this. Because lots of people have been saying, oh, yes, it's only for technocratic reasons he wants to do it. It's nothing to do with his own case. Fine, let's, call that bluff. So that would be interesting. But underneath all this is this question, it seems to me, of motive and how, and what the Prime Minister himself wants, whether he wants a compromise and is to some extent a prisoner of the, more hawkish, more right-wing elements in his own coalition, in fact, even in his own party, in the form of Yariv Levin. If that's right, and he's, wants a compromise, or if he doesn't. But if he does, do you think there's any kind of a burden, almost sort of moral burden, on opposition figures, and for some reason I'm thinking of Benny Gantz, but there might be others, to say to him, look, we will give you the votes you need. We'll come into coalition with you. You can lose some of the more extreme elements. And that way you can get a moderate, genuinely compromised package through without relying on these more extreme elements. Should they be doing that? Or is that to miss the point because he himself does not want a compromise?
As to the question whether Benny Gantz or his friends should enter the coalition, and this is the way they did during COVID, and what we call, going under the military stretch and carrying the wounded because they think they are the ones to save the country, I have no good answer. I mean, as far as politics goes, Benny Gantz was cheated one time by Bibi. I'm not sure he's going to do it twice. On the other hand, really, I don't know. I'm sure for one thing, I'm sure all three of us would give a lot to be a fly on the wall in the conversations between two persons, Netanyahu and Yariv Levin. And what does Netanyahu really feel towards this guy who is his confidant? He goes with him a long way. He trusted him with his closest secrets and political maneuvers. And he knows, we are sure that he knows that Yariv Levin led him to a deadlock, led him to a crisis like no other, like none, like nothing we've known before. I bet the biggest crisis that the state of Israel has ever known in terms of constitutional crisis, social crisis, economic crisis, international crisis. Bibi knows that. He is sharpest than all of us. He's knowledgeable than all of us. He's experienced than all of us. If you ask me if he wants a compromise, it's no secret he does. What will he do to promote one? Or will he stop everything? Or does he still think that he can maneuver us into a kind of compromise that years before he could have sold the public, now he cannot? God knows. And Bibi.
Because you called it you called it blind spots. It's really interesting because, I mean, this is a man, and we're still talking about Netanyahu, who knows to sell everything to everyone. The man is the greatest comeback kid in world politics, I think. And this was run, I'm just looking from his perspective, from the perspective of people who want this overhaul. This was run terribly from the beginning. Even, I think the biggest mistake is probably to try running everything all at once, right, through the Knesset. The hubris of Yariv Levin thinking he could actually get away with it. And I wonder, first of all, what happens to the Netanyahu magic? And on the other side, when you look at the people standing up against this, I don't know if you and I had this conversation 6 months ago, and you had told me that people would be, hundreds of thousands of Israelis would be out in the streets protesting an override clause with the majority of 61. I mean, this is a complicated issue, but people just got it and stepped out. So I guess that's about 5 questions in one question, but I'm talking about the mistakes that one side made and the success of the other side.
As far as the mistakes by one side, as I told you, I think there was a miscalculation. Nadav Argaman, the head of the Shin Bet that I interviewed the other day, said that they thought it will be fast and sharp, and before we know it, the legislation will be behind us. Never happened. As far as the other side goes, I think what Israelis understood is that we are facing a constitutional moment. And that's a term coined by an American legal scholar. His name is Bruce Ackerman. And it's a moment in which history melts into structure and architecture of the state, of its institutions, of its democracy. People understood that we had one constitutional moment in 1948. It was a moment of grace in which the land of Israel was founded and a non-constitution was established. But the Declaration of Independence secured equality for all and secured a Jewish liberal democracy. That was 1948. 2023 is our second constitutional moment in which liberal democracy is up for grabs, in which there is an assault on the Jewish democracy, the only Jewish democracy we ever had. And people understood that, Yonit. I think somehow constitutional law became a household commodity. And that's what drove people to the street. You know, our colleague Ari Shavit once wrote that Israel is the most democratic nation among the threatened ones and the most threatened one among the democratic ones. And now the threat is on democracy itself. But the bad news is that the external threat has gone nowhere. It's not like Hamas joined Likud or Iran has turned its nuclear installations into chocolate factories. And Nasrallah, as you know, is saying out loud, the Jews are weak, it's time to strike. So we have it all, the external threats and the internal threat, and Israelis got it. Now, there's good news and there's bad news, and we can talk about it all, but that's what has driven people to the streets. I know it because I see it, because I feel it, and because I know that it's not a zero-sum game, it's a dangerous game. It's a dangerous game because, as you can see, you hear them. You hear Nasrallah, you hear the Iranians, you hear the Americans, and you see what's happening. It's nothing that we can take easily.
That seems completely persuasive to me, the idea this is a huge moment in the 75-year history of the country. I wonder if historians, though, will look back and say, yes, the moment that, or the cause that brought people out was this change in the constitutional rules, but underneath it was a whole lot of other things, and that there was a sort of pent-up feeling that brought out these protesters, which boils down to a sense that a particular kind of Israel, meaning the people who do the military service, who pay the taxes, often secular, thought up to this point, but we've had it with being pushed and pushed and pushed, and now you've pushed us too far. And that yes, it's got these sort of constitutional mechanisms are the actual prompt, but underneath it is a sense that this other Israel that has been taken for granted for so long has been pushed over a limit, and that's what brought people to the streets. But tell me what you think.
And you know, Jonathan, this is the part that I feel most uncomfortable with regard to the protest, in the sense that the haves are on the streets much more than the have-nots. The fighter pilots, the intelligence officers, the high-tech unicorns. And that's something that we have to bear in mind. This is the Israel that is on the streets. I know it's a generalization. I know there are many other people. But the fact that the fighter pilots are using their privilege to say we will not volunteer anymore, right? Once a week. And those are the fighter pilots that are supposed to strike in Iran or Syria, what have you. This is something which, on the one hand, I mean, it's their right and it's their leverage. On the other hand, it makes me feel uncomfortable in the sense that it exposes, as you said, the rifts within Israeli society between the haves and the have-nots, between liberals and conservatives, between those who believe in the state of Tel Aviv and those who believe in the state of Jerusalem. Now, the point is that we held it somehow together for 75 years, and we thought that this will never happen until it did. And so will we be able to mend the rift? Will we be able to construct? I've been corresponding with Yonit last night to reconstruct this kind of constructive repression. I've never been to a psychologist, I must admit, but I know that they sometimes, or I believe, without going to a psychologist, I believe in repression. You don't have to deal with everything all the time. And we didn't deal with many of those issues for years. The best example is abortion. The issue that tears the American society apart in Israel is resolved in a small room in a hospital with a committee. I know that some women think this should also be over and done with. But this is an example of a constitutional or a legal or a social repression. We don't open it up, we close it, and we solve it somehow. And this is what I hope would happen, because if we open everything up, this society has no future, because it was born as a pluralistic and heterogenic and so colorful society. It held up for 75 years. I hope it does for the next many years.
But this is my point, that if you've opened up Pandora's box like this, then making a little fix to the number of appointments on the judicial committee or whatever isn't going to solve it. You know, now this is opened up, it's too big to put back with just constitutional fixes. It's beyond your point about constitutional moment. It's gone beyond that now. It's actually about who really governs this country. It's
part of the blindness spot. The genies are not going so fast back to the bottle. You're right. Yeah.
But this exactly that feeling, like when we were talking about this, you and I, it's exactly that feeling of, you know, Israel kind of being held up by a lot of scotch tape and ambition, right? And kind of hoping that everything will be okay. This is going to hold. But it's also, I mean, this makes sense maybe in a way that this is happening to us as we are celebrating our 75th year, as celebratory as this will be this year. But I mean, this is a country sort of stepping out of its inception and stepping out of the first stages of its existence and now asking the very tough questions. Who are we? Who do we want to be? Are we one country? Are we two countries? I mean, a ball is rolling downhill. And I'm sort of attaching myself to Jonathan's question here. What happens? Like, this will not die down again because now it's Pesach and they changed a little bit of the writing in the legislation. Like, this is opening up everything. And so what, are we supposed to sort of deny everything and then just go back to normal life? I'm curious.
I'll tell you what, I was reminded last night as we corresponded, you and I, of what the late author Amos Oz wrote many years ago. He said that Israel is a federation of mistakes, that it's a grand bazaar of contradicting dreams and visions of people who came here from all over. Some of them wanted to reconstruct the shtetl, and some of them wanted to rebuild the kingdom of David, and some of them wanted to build a kibbutz and a socialist utopia. And these dreams don't live with each other, but somehow they did, until they didn't. But we all know, all three of us, each and every one of us from his or her point of view, that it has been a dream come true. It did happen. We did manage to build here an amazing society, an amazing country, an amazing miracle. So, and you know what, Yonit? I think about the friends of my kids, okay? The friends of my kids are from everywhere, every place in Israel, from settlements, from big cities, from left, from right, Orthodox and unorthodox, and those who were Orthodox and are not anymore, and gay and straight and everything. Yaeli served for 7 years in the military with people from all over. One of those right-wing guys that texted me after the broadcast last Thursday, he said, I disagree with everything you said, and I'll explain why. And he explained, and I responded. And then he said, you know what? I was an officer with your daughter in Givati. And I love her, so I love you too. So, I mean, there's something to the fabric of this society, and forget about not celebrating Pesach together. We will celebrate Pesach together, and our sister-in-law will be sour because she's such to begin with. It doesn't have anything to do with the judicial upheaval. And we have so many family issues anyway. We'll celebrate Pesach together, and I don't know about Yom Ha'atzmaut, it's going to be a tough one. But what I'm saying is, there is, I'll tell you what, I think there still is a sense of common destiny. Goral meshutaf, that's the one thing that I believe in. There's a sense of common destiny. Perhaps now we cannot feel it because of what's going on in the streets and in government. But I think most Israelis still bear it and still have it in their blood system. This sense of common destiny that brought us to this country, and I hope will keep us together. There's nothing I hope more than that.
Can I just, because I think you're right to focus on the big picture like that, but let me bring us back to the actual sort of mechanics of this thing. And you sketched out different scenarios for the Supreme Court striking down this legislation, but if they do, and you get into this kind of standoff where the government say one thing is the law, and the Knesset say one thing is the law, and the Supreme Court say another, what then happens? I mean, I saw a headline in one of the Israeli papers saying, who does the military take orders from in that situation? I mean, who then is in charge? Because you're also a professor of law, can you talk us through how that plays out?
Everybody's speaking about this constitutional crisis behind the corner, and I think the more we speak about it, the best. Because the more we speak about it, I believe, Jonathan, that our leaders, and particularly one leader, will realize that is something that shouldn't happen. We had Minister Barkat, the Minister of the Economy, the other day, already stating, and that was the first hint within Likud, that they will not go there. They will not disobey the Supreme Court of Justice. I don't see Netanyahu going there. Perhaps, and there's a columnist writing that in Haaretz this morning, Sami Peretz, that perhaps Netanyahu wants Bagatz to do the job for him so that he can turn back to Yariv Levin and say, it's not me, it's them, it's always good to blame Bagatz, it's win-win, everything is good. I don't believe they will go there. And I believe, and that's something, it's one of the reasons that drove me to speak my mind this time, not only last Thursday, but even before that in Meet the Press with our colleagues from Channel 12 and in other places. It's because I think many Israelis and the Prime Minister knows that the Supreme Court of Justice in Israel is not the last fortress. It's the only fortress protecting Israeli democracy. If we have checks and balances, Jonathan, they stay there on this building on the hill in Jerusalem. It's the only kind of checks and balances we have. What I'm talking now is purely empirical data. There was an article, a table, designed by Professor Amichai Cohen from the Israeli Institute of Democracy, and he analyzed 68 democracies. 29 of them have 2 chambers of parliament. 28 of them have a president with executive powers. 11 of them have a federal system of government. 28 are members of the European Union. 35 have regional elections, like you guys in Britain, or are subordinate somehow to the European Court of Justice, like you guys in the UK. None of them is like Israel, in which there's only one guardian of liberal democracy, of human rights, and of the minorities. It's the Supreme Court of Justice. I know that Netanyahu knows that. So when this fortress is in danger of falling, I believe even our leaders, our current leaders, will not let it happen. I think so.
It's not only Barkat, also Aryeh Deri said that he would uphold the decision. And I
Right.
agree with you that the more this is in the mainstream discussion, more people will have to step up and say, this is going to be insanity and you're going to have to stop it before it happens. But I'm wondering about something else, because there is obviously a large group of Israelis who want this reform for whatever reason. If they're settlers and they think that the High Court is done them wrong, or they're, as you said, you mentioned this, right? They're Orthodox who want this exemption for military service, or they just think Netanyahu should get off from his trial, or they're really ideologues who think that the Supreme Court is too powerful and there's a rebalancing of power that's needed. What will happen to those people if tomorrow Netanyahu says, you know what, we're halting. I'm stopping. We'll have to revise. We'll have to rewrite. We're going to stop. And the protests worked and they won, right? What will happen to that group?
You will laugh at me for what I'm going to tell you now, because I never told you that. Mm-hmm. Some years ago, I got a telephone call from the American ambassador to Israel. And he said, I know that you wanted so much the interview with President Obama, but Yonit is going to get it. And it took me a while to say to myself, you win some, you lose some. Now, there's no comparison. But any camp that loses here, and somebody will be resentful, and then will realize you win some, you lose some. Now, as the camp that supports this judicial reform goes, there's one thing that I can relate to, and it's the sentiment. There's a sentiment, a deep sentiment within Orthodox, within settlers, within right-wing, within Bibi supporters, that the Supreme Court was not fair, took too much power, ruled against them too many times. Now, you can quarrel with them, you can argue with them, you can show them wrong in parts of the argument. But at the end of the day, they have this sentiment, and they carry a scar from the disengagement in 2005 and so forth. So we have to relate to this sentiment. But I believe that our job now is to show many Israelis that the Supreme Court of Justice is there for all of them. If you're a minority, when you're a minority, if you're a settler, if you're an Orthodox Jew, if you're a woman, if you're gay, if you're poor, if you're underprivileged, this is what we have to convince them. So it's not like, Yonit, it's not like if you keep the independence of the judicial system, that is what's up for grabs, that will be at the expense of these people. That's what I'm trying to say. But yes, we have to relate to the sentiment. And I think, and that is very important to say, that the Supreme Court of Justice for many years was not attentive. The justices themselves, for years, were not as attentive as they should have been to that sentiment and to that very deep feeling within large parts of the Israeli public.
No, there's a lovely line by Amir Fuchs, who is someone we both know well, Ilana, who said that the Supreme Court has protected Israeli citizens for such a long time. Now it's time for the citizens to protect the Supreme Court. We should just only mention, since you used that metaphor, that you evened the score on the Obama slate. Just for historical record, just to say that happened too. The conversation happened from the other side as well. Yes, Jonathan.
As I said, we win some, we lose some.
I hesitate to get between the two of you on this subject, but you are both being characteristically empathetic to the people who are defending these changes. I just wanted to ask a more skeptical or sort of even perhaps cynical thing about the motive of the people really pushing this. And I get that, there may be some sort of abstract, jurisprudential thinking going on with Levin and Rothman, two of the people pushing for this. But I just wanted to put to you this thesis, which was put to me, which is you've got to see this as very, very practical and hard-headed by two of the groups. One is the ultra-Orthodox think this is the way to fix permanently as a constitutional right their exemption from military service. And on the ultra-nationalist wing, this is a chance at last to erase in any kind of last vestigial legal way the line that separates Israel from the occupied territories. And for both groups, the constitutional reform here that is a very practical prize they need. They need to neutralize, weaken the Supreme Court to make way for those two big changes in the kind of basic, with a small b, basic laws of the country. And if that is right, that's a very useful way to know what we're dealing with here. So this may have to be our final question, but Ilana, what do you think? Do you think that's what's going on with those two groups in particular?
It might be the case that that's what's going on, but bear in mind, Jonathan, that the two issues that you mentioned can be pushed out of the brackets of this whole reform. We can keep Israeli liberal democracy, keep the independence of the judicial system, and resolve the Palestinian problem in another way. I mean, I think the Palestinian problem, the occupation, the annexation, the settlements, is something that has to do with different formulas of risk management by different Israelis. Both of them, all of them, can believe in a liberal democracy and disagree with regard to the Palestinian conflict. The same goes for the mandatory draft of the Orthodox. I think there's a point to be made in favor of immunizing a law that exempts some of all or the majority of whatever, what have you, that lays down a solution for this problem. The Israeli military will do without the ultra-Orthodox, okay? And we can exempt it and immunify it from any judicial review. That can be done if only there is true dialogue, not this kind of brutal blitz in which they not only want an override clause, but they want to immunize all basic laws without defining what a basic law is, and then eroding the status of the legal advisors, and then splitting the role of the attorney general, and then appointing a prosecutor general who might do whatever. This is the point. The blitz, the brutal blitz of legislation, all aimed at the same goal. And I think one thing that we have to realize this week is the following. When we try to estimate where are we and where are we heading with this new revised proposal, it comes after this carpet bombardment that I just tried to describe of bills and statements and laws and legislation, and after the group leading this judicial overhaul has already exposed its cards and its agenda. And I thought about this line, Yonit, that is inscribed at the entrance to the officers' academy in the IDF, Teda kol em ivriya, let every Hebrew mother know that the fate and the life of her son is in the hands of the finest commanders. That's the inscription. So let every Hebrew mother know that the appointment of her judges is in the hands of people who do not believe in a liberal democracy and who try to crush it, and who believe in a very slim, formalistic, anorectic form of democracy in which human rights are not truly protected. This is something that is already clear to many Israelis. From now on, we can continue with the discussion.
Ilana, as I feel always with our conversations, I wish we had another 3 hours to talk.
Can I indulge you with one quote? You know, our friend Amir Fuchs,
Yes.
Yonit, that you mentioned. And Jonathan, I bet you heard about Menachem Begin, right?
Just a little bit, yes.
Jonathan wrote some of his speeches.
Can you imagine?
And you know, our friends from the right and our colleagues from the right always criticize us. Where were you when Begin was in power? You weren't as empathetic to him, and you weren't such big fans of Begin when he was in power. Where I was a young girl, but I remember that even back then I thought that the apocalyptic visions of the left when Begin came to power were nonsense. But Amir Fuchs, our friend, sent me a quote of Begin from an article he wrote back in 1953, when Ben-Gurion was trying to take over the appointments committee for judicial posts, okay? And listen to what Begin wrote. "It is my duty as a citizen of this country to warn its rulers infected with the toxic disease of power from the terrible path on which they mounted, out of fear and aimed at terrifying us. Remember, he who deviates from the verdict of the law defines the verdict of his own government." This is Begin, 1953.
A good note to close on those words. I think we have mentioned a couple of times on the podcast that there was indeed a tradition on the right that's elevated the rule of law to the highest ideal, and that in some ways has been in danger. Ilana, you quoted Amos Oz to us before. I think you've honoured that tradition by giving us words of wisdom and reflection in this 45-minute conversation. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you. And thanks very much for coming on Unholy.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, Jonathan, Yonit. Toda rabba.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilana. Toda rabba.
Bye-bye.
So that was a remarkable conversation with a remarkable woman. I every time I talk to Ilana, I think to myself just how much originality and how articulate and how intellectually deep she is in looking at what is going on now, not only on the ground as we speak, but also sort of zooming out and saying what this means for the country, what it means for our future. In that regard, I thought that was a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and I was really struck by her mention of her roots outside Israel and that connection with a wider Jewish story, as well as a voice inside Israel. So no, a really pleasure and privilege to have Ilana Dayan on Unholy. So we have some business to transact as usual, and in a rare break from precedent, it's the wrong season to talk about the dreidel, but the dreidel of destiny has spun, and unusually it has asked me to dole out the chutzpah awards this week. That is, it's usually the other way around with you and me, but we have a bit of a competition.
I'm just saying the dreidel of destiny could be our alternate title for the podcast. Okay, yes, continue your chutzpah awards.
Quickly, let's patent and trademark dreidel of destiny. That could be a spin-off podcast. I'd quite like that.
Nice.
Theme tune submissions, please. So yes, there's been a bit of a jostle and a wrestling match between two previous winners of our Chutzpah of the Week award. I think perennial winners. And they are Donald J. Trump and Boris Johnson, who are in the bear pit of chutzpah having a sort of wrestling match, because they both have advanced very strong claims. So both of them called to account this week in very different ways. Boris Johnson called before a committee of MPs over whether or not he deliberately misled Parliament when he said there had been all the guidance on COVID had been followed, even as we all saw pictures of Downing Street staff raising a glass and generally partying inside number 10 Downing Street. The argument that he advanced, which is his bid to be the Chutzpah of the Week winner, was that it was absolutely essential under the letter of the law that he thank and raise a glass to Downing Street policy advisors and spin doctors and speechwriters and give them a slice of cake and pat them on the back when they were leaving, as if this was a kind of medical necessity that had to be done. And he said it with this terribly serious face, until the day I die, that was part of my job. And of course, people were tweeting pictures of, doctors collapsed on the floor of hospital wards in protective equipment, wearing masks, distance from each other, and people were putting captions on them saying, cheese and wine, anyone? Everybody, even in jobs that were perhaps slightly more necessary than policy advice and spinning for the Prime Minister, managed to stick to the rules. It was chutzpah for him to say it was an absolute necessity under the rules for him to be partying in Downing Street. But then, hot in his heels, Donald Trump, who may well indeed, as we speak, be about to be indicted by a grand jury in the United States. But that's not the reason why he gets chutzpah. Chutzpah because his rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who he calls Ron DeSanctimonious, posting a message on his own website, Truth Social, which he thinks is like his version of Twitter, warning him that he will be at his side. He will back Ron DeSantis if by any chance he gets accused unfairly of things like, I don't know, says Trump, being attacked by a woman, even classmates that are underage or possibly a man, writes Trump. I mean, this is just so... He's in the gutter and then going several levels below the gutter. As he says, who knows? I don't know. It may just be out there that Ron DeSantis is interested in, people who are underage and male. This is with zero evidence of this, and he just throws it out there. So, who you want to win in this mud wrestle, Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, one of them, I think, has a claim to be this week's chutzpah of the week.
I don't think it's a coincidence that as we near approach our 100th episode, you're going to the classics for the chutzpah award. I think it just makes sense to me. So I want to do I'm doing the mensch this week. I'm very excited about that. I will give it to Margaret Atwood, because not only is she one of my favorite writers, so I think she deserves the mensch award every week. But the reason that I think I picked her this week is that she responded to the Handmaid's Tale protesters here in Israel. We should say something about that for a minute. There's an organization called Bonot Alternativa, Building an Alternative, that has been protesting against violence against women and trying to advance women's rights for about 2.5 years. They came to prominence and even international fame in these protests right now. They've become a symbol of these protests. They walk around, they're clad in red and their heads covered in this white head covering like in the TV series to show this kind of dystopian reality. Sadly, we should maybe make note there are places in the world it's not a dystopian reality, but they're afraid that Israel will become this place that subjugates women. And this is something that kind of made waves all over the world. Margaret Atwood retweeted 2 tweets describing this and giving this aerial photo. She's quite enthusiastic about it, and she wrote astonishing, and she wrote she's never seen so many women walking around this way except in the TV series. So I think that she deserves a little bit of credit. Also, we should say, Netanyahu has been talking to every English-speaking outlet for the past 3 months, explaining and trying to explain that his judicial overhaul does not hurt democracy. This one photo, one retweet by Margaret Atwood changes the whole view on a government that we should say has no top women ministers. The parties in the coalition are all men. 2 parties in the coalition actually don't accept women at all. In fact, this week was another example of this when the electronic bracelet law was brought forth in the Knesset plenum. The law says that men who have been giving restraining orders against their wives or partners and don't obey these restraining orders need to walk with an electronic bracelet law. But Ben-Gvir, who again is the minister responsible for the police, thought the law shouldn't pass because he wanted to protect men falsely accused. His new law will go further to balance men's rights. Now, the coalition not only dropped this law brought forth by the opposition, but also basically forced the coalition's women to vote against it. So this all ties together in that way, and she makes it very, very prominent the minute she retweets these pictures from Israel.
Totally right, and her sort of shout out to them, elevated them and made more people see it. But just imagine that as a writer, a conjurer of worlds, that you have given the world this symbol. And it's partly obviously the TV series as well, because that's where the iconography of the red cape and the white hat comes from, but just imagine having given that to the world and then you see it becoming this real thing like that. Just an extraordinary achievement for a writer, and for The Handmaid's Tale and everything it represents. Margaret Atwood has, truly earned a place in history. That will be now part of the, collective imagination for, years and years to come. So a worthy Mensch of the Week winner for Margaret Atwood. If you are, this was a packed episode. If you are enjoying these, and we remind you that this was the 99th episode of Unholy, we hopefully bring up our century next week. If you enjoy what we do and if you enjoy listening to it, many of you have been very generous in your reviews and ratings. It does really help, because if you do that on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, it means more people see that Unholy is there, and that brings yet more people to the party, as Boris Johnson would put it. So we are very, very grateful to you for doing that.
Yes, us and our dreidel of destiny. We're all grateful, and we shall say thank you to Gaia Glazer, Omer Primat, Rom Atik, and Yair Bashan. See you at episode 100, Mr. Friedland, soon to come.
Really looking forward to it. And you know what, Yonit, you were right.
That will be my ringtone. Have a good week.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.